Well, here goes nothing. Reflect on the themes, big ideas, and events that occurred during the era of historical globalization. Compare those to themes, big ideas, and events that surrounded the current era of economic globalization. In the context of globalization, to what extent have we learned from our past mistakes? During the era of historical globalization, the time when Christopher Columbus sailed to America in 1492, and the end of World War II, the main focus for colonizing was the 3 Gs. These were gold, glory, and God. Discovering North America was a huge step for Europe. During the time before Christopher Columbus sailed to America, everyone thought the world only consisted of Europe, coastal Africa, parts of the Middle East, India, and China. Columbus's goal was to find a new and direct route to Asia. He believed that if he sailed west of Europe, he would be able to loop back around to Asia. However, instead of making it to Asia, Christopher Columbus landed in what we now know as Cuba. They refer to this newly discovered land as the New World. Once colonization started to occur in this New World, the mother countries saw this as a way to make a lot of money and gain quite a fair amount of power. It was around this time when mercantilism was implemented and really started to shine for these mother countries. Nowadays, mercantilism is more commonly known as restricted trade. The main idea of mercantilism is that the colonies could only trade with the mother countries. That way, they could control where the wealth went and make sure that no one other than them were receiving it. In order for the colonies to gain this wealth and then give to the mother country, someone had to be negatively affected. Because let's be honest, there's never a happy ending. This time, it was the First Nations of North America. The colonizers exploited the First Nations for their land, resources, and pretty much anything else you can think of. It was all taken from them so that the larger countries overseas could gain wealth. Sounds familiar? We'll get to that later. You may be thinking, did all this exploitation and control over trade ever stop? Yes, it did. Well, sort of. At the end of World War II, a different form of globalization was pushed upon the world. Economic globalization. Although economic globalization had been around since the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't implemented too often. It wasn't until the end of World War II that it really started to grow rapidly. During this wonderful time, we saw the fall of empires and the rise of corporations and businesses. In many countries, we saw the removal of the mercantile system and saw the rise of free trade, the ability to trade with any country outside of your borders. This opened the door for many new opportunities. So, looking at globalization in terms of trade from historical to economic forms of globalization, I think we can safely say that things have gotten a bit better. However, some of these new opportunities, while they may have increased wealth, weren't always ethically and morally correct. With the decrease in government control, bigger companies could get away with a lot more. This arguably made exploitation worse, and definitely easier to accomplish. Companies take advantage of people living in third world countries and make them work in dingy factories for little to no pay, just so the company can spend less on the product being made. This has resulted in a great increase in wealth for many larger corporations and changed the way we acquire our goods today. However, it has ruined the lives of many less fortunate people. Mind you of anyone? Maybe the First Nations and European colonies? Overall, I believe the change over from mercantilism to capitalism has greatly benefited our modern economy, especially us in the first world. However, we do need to recognize how it has affected the people in the third world countries and begin making steps towards helping them and decreasing the amount of economic exploitation we see in the world today. What did you learn about yourself as you studied globalization? In what way has this course changed your view? This course has allowed me to take a step back from my own personal life in society, or even country, and see the bigger picture and how we can and should work towards the greater good for our entire world. My worldview has become less centralized on my own culture and more on a global scale culture. What have you learned about globalization that you could apply directly to your life now? One of the main things I personally have learned about globalization is the often unfair use of exploitation of smaller and weaker countries by the larger, more powerful countries and companies. This is done through the use of sweatshops and underpaid labor in third world countries. One of the most effective things I can do in my life right now is looking more closely at where the products I am purchasing are made. By avoiding products made in third world countries, I'm taking that step to help get rid of economic exploitation of third world countries entirely. Why do you think critical thinking is increasingly becoming an important aspect of citizenship in our globalized world today? The rise of globalization has caused a great increase in exchange of ideas and information. This is especially prominent on the internet, with all the news sites that exist. Critical thinking is very important nowadays because of these news sites. Some of these sites are very credible, but there are a lot out there that aren't necessarily always telling you the truth. People need these critical thinking skills to be able to pick out those fake news sources. Otherwise, we will be fed all this fake news until that will alter our worldview to ideas and beliefs that aren't necessarily true. The more we teach critical thinking in today's society, the better tomorrow's generation will be at picking out what is true and what may be a well-constructed lie or biased opinion. Critical thinking also just applies to almost everything and every job. No matter where you end up in life, there will be times where you're going to have to make a decision by assessing the situation and applying your critical thinking skills, assuming you have them. To what extent has globalization served to improve the quality of life of all humans? To those who are on the side of globalization that greatly benefits from it, they would be all for globalization. The cheap goods, access to more resources, and labor that is almost free. Sounds pretty great if you ask me, and they love it too. But if we're talking about the quality of life of all humans, we need to look at the other side of globalization, the darker side of things. This side of globalization involves those who are taken advantage of and exploited. These are the people who live in third world countries and work in factories owned and operated by larger companies, often overseas. Factories which, in most cases, have terrible working conditions and offer little to no pay. Now, some may argue that this is good because people who would otherwise be unemployed can now have a job in one of these factories. And that would be somewhat true. However, only if the conditions they work in were drastically improved. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. So, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they would rather go back to their old lives where, yes, they may have been unemployed, but they didn't live in fear of their work building collapsing on them. Simply put, while globalization may seem great and revolutionary to you, to others it is quite the opposite and doesn't benefit the quality of life of all humans. From what you've learned, what advice would you give yourself to strengthen their learning in your next social studies course? What did you learn about yourself, and how do you learn? During this course, I learned, to my surprise, that in social studies I learn better through application-based projects and other forms of applied work. I often learn best through someone just talking to me and telling me the material. In social studies, I'm a bit different. Taking the things I've learned in class and actually applying it to projects allows me to not only remember the material, but get more from it than just memorizing it by applying what I learned to my everyday life. Doing things like making a fake news report on the potlatch ban really allowed me to dive into the different things we learned and take a lot more out of it. What have you learned about risk, struggle, and failure's role in learning as a result of taking this course? Well, while I was taking this course, I learned a lot about risk, and sometimes how taking risks will reap the best rewards. An example of this is when I wrote my song for the True Cost project. At first I was a little concerned about doing this project, and I wasn't sure how it would turn out. Although, I learned a lot more than I would have by doing a different project, because I had to put in a bit more work writing a song. This extra work I put in paid off because I got a good mark in the end. I also found that struggle is a very important part when it comes to learning something new. It's almost better to struggle with something right off the start, because then you know that you may need to solidify your knowledge on a certain subject, and you'll come out knowing a lot more. If you perhaps didn't acknowledge that you were struggling at the beginning, or just flat out didn't try, what are you going to do when it's necessary to know that topic, and you don't because you had no mistakes to build off from the start? Failure, in some ways, is similar to struggle. In both situations, you come out of them knowing more than you did before, because you now know what you need to work on and what not to do next. Both of these are important for doing your best work and gaining a greater understanding of a certain topic. Why did or didn't you take advantage of redos and retakes, and how did that help you grow as a learner? One of the reasons I didn't necessarily take advantage of the retakes is because I was worried that I would somehow do worse the second time around, which probably wasn't true. But I think one of the other reasons for not doing it was the stress. Already being stressed for the actual test, and then having the option to retake the said test and go through all the stress of testing again just didn't appeal to me. Don't think it appealed to anybody. On both tests, I got a decent mark. I may have expected to do better, but it didn't bother me too much. I just didn't see going through all that stress again worth gaining a mark or two when I was already mostly content with my work. Although, it probably would have been beneficial to take advantage of said retakes. I learned that sometimes it's worth going through some stress in order for a chance to do better at something the second time around, and that the stress will only last for so long. Another reason for not taking the retakes was just simply being too busy to take them. However, that didn't have as much as an impact as the stress about them. Taking into consideration the fact that we only took 2 tests this year, I don't have many examples, so I'll just use our most recent test as one. On our most recent test, I didn't do as well on the written response as I would have hoped, so I was really contemplating about retaking it. However, I did do exceptionally well in the multiple choice, which I knew would bump up my grade. Because I did so well in the multiple choice, I wasn't too worried about retaking the written portion. However, I think I was more or less distracting myself from the fact that I just didn't want to go through all the stress of taking the test again. And I simply was too busy with choir and other commitments. Looking back, it probably would have been beneficial to have done the retake. So, if I'm ever in that situation again, you best believe I'll be taking that retake any day. If you could go back, would you do anything differently? If I could go back, the most important thing I would do differently in this course would be to actually take notes during class. Sure, I wrote a few things down here and there, but I didn't take notes as often as I should have. I often found myself lost after class, trying to put together what I had just learned, or what I was supposed to learn. Taking notes would have, without a doubt, solved that problem. Focusing on writing stuff down would have required me to pay attention to what we were learning more, and if I wasn't sure what I learned during a class, I could just refer to my notes afterwards. While I'm not sure how big of a difference it would make, practicing taking notes and working on that skill would have definitely helped me in future courses, and I plan on practicing this skill during my time in high school. I guess that's the end. So, thanks for a great class, Kenny, and thanks for watching. Meme review. I don't know if I'm going to drink the rest of it, because it could be my lunch.